you really can't discuss the work of Clive Barker without also discussing the films that he's been involved with. Most people, I would argue, know Barker through his film work more so than through his novels and his books and his short stories, which is a great shame because I would argue that he is perhaps a better writer than he is a director. He's certainly more interested, or was more interested. I'm not quite sure what the status is now, but he was more interested in writing than he was directing. Um, I mean, I didn't even know that Barker made wrote books rather. I had no idea that Barker wrote books until long after I'd first seen Hellraiser and the Candyman and so on and so forth. I had no idea. And even when I first read my first Barker novel, which was Weave World, I didn't put two and two together. I didn't really, I didn't notice that the Clive Barker who wrote Weave World was the same Clive Barker who wrote Hellraiser. It was that I was only 11 years old, so I was sort of on the cusp of that period in time when you start to realize that the things you enjoy are created and are flawed and could potentially be better. It was part of that process for me. It was actually part of learning about created things and how things are put together, how work like film and novels occur. Um, but my exposure to Barker's films came much, much earlier. When I was a child, I mean, I recall seeing Hellraiser when I was very, very young indeed, and it's one of the few films, certainly one of the few horror films that maintained a certain power when I was a child and an adolescent, and still does to a certain degree. It is still an interesting film, but not the first film that Barker was involved with, or that derives from Barker's work at least. There are a few more beforehand. Um, really, you need to go right back to the very beginning of Barker's career, its putative state when he was in the latter days of high school. What would be considered the sort of A level situation in the UK at this point when he was sort of 18, 19. If you have any of the more recent boxed sets, DVD or Blu-ray of the Hellraiser series, then you will actually have examples of the films that he and his friends made during that period, they're interesting works, but they're very much early filmmaker student works. They have no budget. I mean, literally none. They are films that are made for a budget of like 50 pence and half a Kit Kat. As a result, they rely upon a certain degree of artistic invention in order to tell whatever stories they have. They're short, they are largely silent, they don't have any dialogue or anything like that, and borrow lots of visual techniques for their storytelling from traditions like German expressionism and surrealism and so on and so forth. They're actually very interesting. They're very interesting works because they're non-commercial. They're not intended to make money, and they don't come from money. So they are purely artistic, and that makes them interesting. Um, you have to have a particular head on, a particular frame of mind in order to get the best out of them. But they are powerful and they are interesting. The images presented are powerful and interesting. And what's really fascinating about them is if you have followed Barker's career, then you can actually see the beginnings of the images and the concepts that will obsess him throughout his career. For example, in the film The Forbidden, which many of you, the title of which many of you will realize from the Books of Blood. It's actually the name of the short story that became the Candyman. And it's not the same story. It's a totally different story. It just happens to have the same name. There is a sequence in which a man who is played by Pete Atkins, who many of you will know as a very prominent figure in film writing and in television and in short stories. He writes lots of horror short stories. One of Barker's friends and one of those who sort of came out of the self-contained industry that Clive Barker coalesced around himself. Um, Pete Atkins plays a man who somehow calls down these very unusual angelic creatures that end up ritualistically flaying him, which of course is imagery that we find later on in a subtly altered form in Hellraiser. You'll also find in I don't know whether it's in the Forbidden or whether it's in. I believe it is in Forbidden. The other one is Salome. Um, in the Forbidden, you will find the image of the lattice work with nails driven into the interstices, which, of course, Barker later transplants onto a human head to create the concept of the lead Cenobite, Pinhead, which is an image that endures to this very day in various forms of media, from films to books to comic books. It's an interesting historical exercise. They're not necessarily films that you would watch for pleasure. They're engaging and interesting and require a lot of input from the viewer in order to get the best out of. Well, that's the beginning of Barker's filmic career. Later on, after he's had some measure of success with the Books of Blood, you get adaptations of stories like Rawhead Rex. There is a film of Rawhead Rex out there, and the less said about it, the better, to be perfectly honest. Barker has himself disavowed it, and not without reason. It's a terrible film. It's the original short story is excellent. It's a violent, visceral, murderous piece of work that is a meditation on the nature of violence and what the imagery that we popularly consume through horror through works of horror and why it obsesses us. The film adaptation misses the point of all of that quite significantly and just becomes a silly monster movie with a monster that looks like it would not shame the set of a Power Rangers episode. Um, and none of the intelligence or the wit or the intrigue of the original short story. It is just a silly, gruesome, passably gory, explosion laden bit of dreck, and it's not worth your time. It's not even so bad it's good, it's just not worth bothering with. And Barker has himself publicly disavowed it. But what's interesting about the likes of Rawhead Rex is that it was so bad that it was one of the things that inspired Barker to say, you know what, if people who claim to know how to do this stuff make such shitty work out of my stories, then I can't do any worse. Let's put it that way. I may not be able to do any better, but I may not be able to. I can't do any worse, so I may as well just give it a go. Which is what leads eventually to the project of Hellraiser, which was originally a an independent film here in the UK. It was going to be made for much less than it eventually did. And even given its the maximum budget, it eventually accrued, which I believe was something like I think it was $90,000 or something like that, which is even at the time was peanuts. That's less than the vast majority of independent films that were being made at the time, even though it had backing from New Line at that point. Um, that's what inspired it. And originally, it was only going to be this small this tiny independent British film. But because of the work Barker was putting into it, and not to mention those around him, it started to accrue attention from certain studios in Hollywood, which then gave it a bit more of a budget and allowed for some of the more iconic scenes to be created. For example, there would have been none of Frank's resurrection scene without that money. And Frank's resurrection scene is arguably the best in the entire film. It's arguably the most iconic for me anyway. It's certainly the most successful in terms of the special effects and the atmosphere, and what sells the ethos of the film. Now, I can't remember when I first encountered Hellraiser. I honestly can't remember. It's one of those things that has been around pretty much since I was born, owing to my mum's VHS collection of horror films. I cannot remember, like Transformers, like Nightmare, like certain toys and cartoons and comics. I cannot remember a time when there was not Hellraiser, when the image of Pinhead was not somewhere floating around in my consciousness. So I cannot tell you when I first saw it. What I can tell you is that it is one of those films, one of those horror films that obsessed me as a child and as an adolescent, for the simple reason that it was so different from everything else. So different. What I didn't appreciate when I was a child was that it was not just trying to scare me. And the reason I found it so compelling and disturbing is because it wasn't just trying to scare or disturb, it was trying to attract me, it was trying to engage me. It's a rare example of a popular horror film of the era that has some smarts about it. It has the it has certain resonances that are not unlike the Forbidden and Salome, that are more artistic, that are more symbolic. It is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination on a technical level. It has lots of flaws. It has lots of problems. Not least of which, and certainly the most annoying for me, is that the American studios wanted the cast dubbed over so that they have American accents, despite the fact that it is clearly set in Liverpool. I mean, that makes no fucking sense at all, and it really, for me, it damages the film quite dramatically. I hate hearing American accents coming out of people who are clearly in the middle of a street in the UK or in Liverpool. It's fucking ridiculous. But beyond that, it is still a powerful and engaging film. And I would argue a step apart from many popular horror films of the era. It's a step apart because it is not so rabidly conservative. It is not just a case of here's the monster, here's the victims and the heroes, and you know how all of that's going to play out. It just doesn't work like that. There are these odd dynamics and situations going on throughout that I only started to appreciate as an adult. For one thing, you have the Cenobites themselves, which are, of course, the lingering image from the film. Now, it's hard to imagine now because the Cenobites are so like Lovecraft's Cthulhu and Elder Things, these images that were new when they were written. No one had come up with this sort of thing before. It's hard to imagine now because you can get pinhead bobbleheads and pinhead plushes and shit like that. The Cenobites were unlike anything that had ever been seen in horror cinema at the time, certainly in popular horror cinema. These creatures that existed in states of such extremity, but which married aesthetics that were papal and had a certain BDSM bondage quality to them, but were also priestly and sort of profound in terms of their presence. They don't move like a standard horror movie monster or villain move. They are slow, they are sedate, they have a certain magisterial quality about them that is absolutely engaging. And this comes through in the way they engage too, in the way they speak. Most often when they speak, it is in this very cultivated, cultured tone. They're not just grunting, they're not laughing or wisecracking, as was the tendency at the time for horror movie monsters. They speak in these dulcet, poetic tones that are more resonant of Frankenstein's monster in the original Mary Shelley book than was popular at the time. They are more that than they are, say, Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers or anything to that effect. They have philosophy and intention that is far and beyond these entities, far and beyond these creatures. What they bring is something that is desirable. It is something that is desirable. Otherwise, of course, they wouldn't occur at all. You wouldn't get people opening the box, the lament configuration, if that didn't happen, if that wasn't the case. What they bring is attractive. And of course, Cenobites wouldn't exist at all if what they provided wasn't desired to a certain degree. That's the interesting thing about them. They are, as Pinhead himself puts it, both angels and demons, depending on who you are and what intention you open the box with. What I really like at this point, when you look at the original film in isolation, is that a lot of the stuff that accrues around the Cenobites later, with the sequels, with the comics, with the novels that have been written about them, the sort of tumescent philosophy and mythology doesn't exist at this point. So you sort of have to piece two and two together. It's little suggestions, like when Pinhead says that they are demons to summon angels to others. You need to interpret the significance of that. And of course, the significance of that is that some people want what they have to give. Some people delight in the state of extremity that they bring. And what they bring is not just horror, it is not just agony, it is not just pain, it is pleasure and pain and states of extremity that completely do away with those concepts, that allow you to transgress yourself, to become something other, to become something more. They exist at the height of this state. That's the thing with the Cenobites. They have reached a particular point where self-mutilation, where elaborate pain doesn't mean a great deal. It brings them to a state of operation that is metaphysical. in its extremity and in its removal from humanity. It's very cool, and it's the kind of concept that you just do not find in horror films. Not only then, but even now, you very rarely find that degree of ambiguity. And that's one of the interesting things about the Cenobites. In the original film, they're actually quite ambiguous. They are not completely threatening. In point of fact, they engage with characters. They engage with Frank. They engage with Kirsty, and they ask them what they want. They are kind of they do not just emerge and eviscerate people, but apart from in later films. In later films, of course, they remove all of that ambiguity and they just become mega monsters. But in this film, they don't. They are interested. They want to know what's happening around them. They're engaged with the world and with the other characters, and they speak to them. They engage with them. Hence, you have Kirsty, who opens the box somewhat innocently, not knowing what it will do, striking a deal with them. You also have, removed from the extremity that the Cenobites represent, you have this domestic drama playing out between Frank, Kirsty, Larry, and Julia. You have this family, this twisted family drama that could have been an interesting film in its own right, quite frankly, where you have the the wife who is disaffected, who probably married the person she shouldn't have. You have the husband who is just a boring, boring man who has no real appetites or engagement. You have Frank, who is the other man, who is the adulterer, the affair, who is violent and exciting and dark and dangerous. And then you have Kirsty, who is sort of the Electra complex character, who has this relationship with her father that's perhaps a little bit weird, that may be a little bit too extreme and affectionate. So you have this dynamic going on with her and Julia, who is the stepmother. She's the wicked stepmother of the fairy tale. That is unfair. She doesn't like Julia, but Julia doesn't necessarily do anything at the beginning to warrant that dislike. That's one of the interesting things. Julia is a sympathetic character for all the stuff she does, and she gets up to some awful stuff in this film. She's actually, for me, she's the most sympathetic character. I understand Julia and her boredom with Larry and her sense of feeling trapped in this loveless, sexless, um, grinding domestic sphere that leads her to, of course, eventually find Frank after he's been torn apart by the Cenobites and free him from them, by bringing him men to consume, and murdering them. I mean, that's one of the other fun dynamics of the film. Julia has this transformation, this sort of metamorphosis that's butterfly like. She starts as this kind of wretched woman who is beautiful and well turned out, but is just a doll. She's there to hang on Larry's arm. That's all she exists for. But is bored with it. She hates her life. She hates her husband. She hates her friend. She hates her stepdaughter. She's trapped, but she finds a way out. And that is through extremity. She finds a certain celebration in the murders that she ultimately commits for Frank, and becomes a better character for it. She becomes a stronger character for it, and that's really interesting. That in itself is interesting. That domestic sphere occurs whilst you have at the same time these extreme things going on with Frank's resurrection, with the Cenobites coming to chase him down, with Kirsty eventually summoning them to take Frank back. It's very, very cool. It's very well structured. There are bits of it that don't really pay off. I mean, there's no the boyfriend character. I can't even remember his name. That Kirsty has is useless. He's pointless. He shouldn't have been in it. And he kind of derives and draws away from the um, the dynamic between her and Larry a little bit. In fact, I think that's why he's there. I think he dilutes the Electra complex dynamic a little bit. I like the Electra complex in it, quite frankly. I think it works really well for that. Um, it also doesn't necessarily have that satisfying a conclusion. It feels a little bit rushed, as though they maybe ran out of money and ran out of time with the film. It's interesting, but it's not quite as, it doesn't pay off quite as it feels like it should somehow, and that's a shame. But it is still an engaging and interesting film. Even now, it's one of those films I rewatch at least once a year, every year, and I do find something new in it every single time. Every single time I watch it, I find something new to engage me. It's a fascinating film, a flawed film, massively flawed. I mean, massively flawed. I'm not sure it would even fly in its current state to modern audiences. Certainly not with the slickness of films like, say, It flying around. I don't think it would fly. But almost everything Barker touches, it has this wounded power to it. And it's also very interesting if you are a film student, perhaps, or a fan of horror cinema in terms of its history, then it's very significant. You need to watch it because you need to see what changes the landscape of horror. And it did. Hellraiser completely changed the landscape of horror in the 1980s. It not only made Barker, it took Barker from being a pauper, literally a pauper, to being a millionaire almost overnight. It also changed horror cinema completely. Suddenly, there was this appetite for the strange and for the surreal and for the extreme. It showed people what was possible in horror cinema, and on a very limited budget. It showed people that, yeah, they don't want endless slasher films. They don't want endless knockoffs of Halloween and whatnot. They want something weird. They want something strange. They want something ambiguous, slightly artistic, and something that makes them feel more than just shocks or fright or disturbance, something that unsettles them on a deeper level. And that's what's interesting about the original Hellraiser. Now, I won't be going over the other Hellraiser films for the simple reason that Barker's involvement with them is tangential at best. He is involved with Hellbound to a degree, the first sequel, and to a much lesser degree, I think he is somewhat involved with Hellraiser 3, but not a great deal. After that, he's all ties are cut. Needless to say, most of the sequels are dreck. The original sequel, Hellbound, is actually a very interesting film indeed. It's like the original, enormously flawed. I mean, just massively flawed in many key ways, but I like it a lot. I like it a hell of a lot. It's actually, along with Hellraiser 1, one of those films I will watch once a year, every year, and is well worth a look. Um, it is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it goes to places and does stuff with the mythology and the imagery that you would never have expected. No one expected, least of all Barker. It's a very unexpected piece of work, well worth a look. Beyond that, don't bother. I would say beyond that, forget it because they're all awful. And kudos to Doug Bradley who plays Pinhead for sticking with the series for so long. They are a waste of your time beyond that. Not even so bad they're good. No, just no good. Just not good at all. Um, in the next video, I will have a look at Barker's next cinematic work, which is again, and you forgive me, but you'll be hearing this a lot, the flawed but interesting Nightbreed.